The first thing Mara Voss noticed about the estate was that it breathed. Not metaphorically, not the way poets mean when they say old houses have souls. She meant it in the most literal, unsettling sense, that at 3:17 in the morning, standing outside the iron gate in the rain with her transfer papers soaking through their envelope, she could hear the structure exhale. A low, rhythmic pulse of warm air from somewhere beneath the stone, as though something vast and alive coiled under the foundation, dreaming. She told herself it was the heating system. She told herself a lot of things in those first minutes outside Cauldron House. Mara was 31 years old, a xenoarchaeologist with 3 published papers, and a reputation for taking contract positions that more established researchers considered beneath them. She had spent 8 months in the Yellen Basin cataloging per-contact alien agricultural implements. She had eaten field rations for so long that her idea of a good meal was anything that required refrigeration. She was not, by any standard, a woman who frightened easily. But the gate opened before she touched it. There was no one on the other side. The motion sensor light over the entrance caught nothing but rain and the stone pathway leading up to the house. She stood there for 3 full seconds with her hand raised, listening, and then she picked up her bag and walked in because she had nowhere else to go, and the Cauldron Institute paid 40% above the standard xenoarch salary, and she had student loans that didn't care about her comfort level. The door at the end of the path opened the same way the gate had. Inside, the house was warm, not mechanically warm, not the dry, ventilated warmth of climate control, but the deep, pressurized warmth of a place that generated heat from within. She set her bag in the entry hall and stood on the stone floor and felt it through the soles of her boots, like standing on a living thing. "Dr. Voss." The voice came from the staircase. She turned. He was tall in the way that registers before anything else about a person, the way her eyes adjusted, the way her sense of scale recalibrated. Lord Cauldron was in his mid-30s maybe, with the kind of face that had been handsome so long it had forgotten to try. Dark hair pushed back from a high forehead. Gray eyes, or perhaps green, the entry light wasn't kind to color. He was dressed like a man who had given up on the idea that clothing communicated anything meaningful. Dark trousers, a shirt with the top 2 buttons open, no jacket despite the formal architecture of the house around him. He came down the stairs slowly. Not warily, she would learn the difference later. He moved the way all of them moved. She would eventually understand. With the deliberate caution of a large predator in an enclosed space, choosing each step. "I wasn't expecting you until morning," he said. "Not an accusation, a fact being processed. My train connection came through early. I should have called." She extended her hand. "Mara Voss." He looked at her hand for a fraction of a second too long. Then he took it. His grip was warm, much warmer than she expected, and he released her exactly as quickly as protocol demanded. "Ethan Cauldron," a pause. "I'll show you to your rooms." She followed him up the stairs, and in the silence of that climb she had the unshakable sensation that the house was paying attention to her. Not Ethan, the house itself. She was there to catalog what the Institute diplomatically described as a private collection of xenobiological artifacts. What that meant in practice, she discovered in the first week, was a basement the size of a small museum, filled with objects that should not have been in private hands. Objects that most governments had spent decades insisting didn't exist. First contact officially had been 43 years ago. Unofficially, as anyone in xenoarchaeology knew, anyone who read between the lines of the declassified documents and compared notes with colleagues at 3 in the morning over bad wine, it had been much, much earlier. The Cauldron collection was evidence of how much earlier. She spent her mornings in the basement and her evenings writing field notes and her nights lying awake in the enormous 4-poster bed listening to the house breathe. She saw Ethan Cauldron at breakfast sometimes, and occasionally at dinner, and he was polite in the way of a person who has been raised to be polite rather than actually choosing it. He answered her questions about provenance. He let her have unrestricted access to the collection. He was careful not to touch anything she had already touched, and she noticed this without yet having a category for it. By the second week, she had begun to suspect that something was wrong with the staff. There were 6 of them, a housekeeper, 2 groundskeepers, a cook, and 2 others whose specific function Mara never quite identified. They were not unfriendly. They were, in fact, attentive to the point of unease, appearing before she'd registered a need, anticipating requests she hadn't vocalized. But their eyes tracked her in a way that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with assessment. And occasionally, when she came around a corner too quickly, she caught them in the middle of exchanges that stopped the moment they sensed her. She was in the basement cataloging a series of what appeared to be ceremonial markers, small carved discs with patterns she had only ever seen in 2 other locations, both classified, when she found the door. It was behind a shelf unit, and it would not have been findable at all if she hadn't been measuring the room's dimensions against her map and discovered a 16-foot discrepancy in the east wall. The shelf moved more easily than it had any right to, and the door behind it was unlocked, and beyond it was a corridor lit by the same sourceless amber light that ran under the eaves of the main house. She stood at the entrance for a long time. Then she went in. The corridor went down before it went anywhere else, sloping gradually into a depth she hadn't expected. The stone here was different from the house above, older, she could tell by the grain and the way the mortar had settled, centuries older, the kind of old that predated the house by so long that it might predate the concept of the house. The carvings on the walls were not decorative. She had enough training to recognize a continuous narrative when she saw one. This was a record. She moved slowly, reading. Her training had given her 7 cataloged languages of non-human origin. She recognized 3 of them in the carved sequence, layered over each other in a way that suggested either translation or evolution. A single story told across centuries in successive tongues. She was deep enough that she had lost track of time when the corridor ended in a chamber. The chamber was circular, maybe 20 feet across, and at its center was a plinth of dark stone that held what she would later determine was the most significant object she had ever encountered in her professional life. She would not write that in her field notes. She would not write it anywhere. But she knew it in the moment she saw it, the way you know certain things, the way you recognize a song you've never consciously heard. It was a crown. Not metaphorically, not ceremonially, not decoratively. A crown in the operational sense, a structure of material she couldn't immediately identify, formed in a continuous band with 3 raised points, each of which caught the ambient light and held it. Functional, designed to be worn. And around its base, carved into the plinth, a line of script she could read. She read it 3 times to make sure she had it right. By right of blood and witness and the willingness to bear it, here waits the throne of the first treaty. Her hands were not shaking. She was proud of that. She reached out and touched the crown. The light in the chamber changed. She came back to herself on the stone floor of the corridor, and Ethan Cauldron was crouched 6 feet away from her, watching her with an expression she would spend weeks trying to accurately describe. Not anger, not fear, exactly. Something older than either of those, the look of a person watching an event they'd been told to expect and had never actually believed would happen. "Don't move," he said. His voice was different, lower, more careful. "Not yet." "What?" "In a moment, just give it a moment." She gave it a moment. Her body felt distant, like a garment she'd put on wrong. The amber light was still everywhere. The crown was back on its plinth. She didn't remember putting it down. "How long?" she said. 3 hours. She processed that. "I was out for 3 hours." "Yes. That should be a medical emergency." "It isn't," he paused. "Not for you, not anymore." She sat up slowly. Her perception of the room had changed. She could feel the boundaries of the chamber without looking at them, sense the corridor behind her as a thing with physical presence, feel the house above as something attached, an extension, like a room you've always known was there. "Tell me," she said. He sat down across from her on the stone floor, which was not what she expected from a man who moved the way he moved, and he told her. The Cauldron family were not human. They had not been human for approximately 11,000 years, at which point, in the vocabulary of his people, they had shifted. Not evolved, that wasn't the right word for it. The change had been deliberate, chosen, a response to a specific crisis that his ancestors had decided could only be survived by becoming something other than what they were. What they became was, in the most reductive possible framing, a new species. Long-lived, physiologically adaptable, with capabilities that human biology could not sustain. What they were called, in their own language, translated most accurately as the bearing kind. They had been hidden not because they feared humanity, but because the treaty that governed their coexistence, a treaty signed 41 centuries ago, before the collapse of the civilization that had witnessed it, specified concealment. The treaty had parties on both sides, the bearing kind. And the Meridian Assembly, the alien civilization whose technology had made the original shift possible, and whose descendants, Mara now understood, were responsible for every first contact event that human governments had been documenting for the past 4 decades. The crown was not decorative, the crown was the treaty. Specifically, it was what the treaty called a witness bearer, an object that recorded, verified, and transmitted the terms of an agreement to all parties across any span of time. The first treaty had been dormant for centuries because the last verified witness bearer had been human, and humans died, and no human since had been able to touch the crown without his exact word, rejecting it. "What does that mean?" Mara asked, "rejecting it." "It means the contact does nothing. The crown doesn't recognize them." He looked at her. "Until now." She thought about that. What did it do to me? What it does to anyone who carries treaty right. It read you. It verified your lineage and your intent, and it recorded you as a holder of witness. He paused. "That means you are now, under the terms of the first treaty, the legitimate human throne, the treaty representative for your species." The word came out of her before she considered it. "What?" "I know how it sounds. I'm a contract archaeologist." "Yes. I'm from Dusseldorf." "I know. My mother was a librarian." "Mara," his voice was the quietest she'd heard it. "I know. The treaty doesn't care. It never cared about breeding or status or choice of profession. It cares about lineage, about a specific genetic signature that goes back 11,000 years to the people who were present at the original agreement. Your family has been carrying that signature for 140 generations. It was always going to end up here." She was quiet for a long time. The chamber felt different now, less like a room and more like a recognition, like somewhere that had been waiting. "You knew," she said finally. "You knew what I was when I arrived." He didn't flinch. "We suspected. We couldn't know for certain until you." "Until I touched it." She looked at the crown on its plinth. "That's why the Institute hired me. That's why the collection, why the position." "Yes. You engineered this." "We facilitated an opportunity. We couldn't compel you. The treaty can't be manipulated that way if the contact isn't genuine, if the witness bearer doesn't verify willingness, it doesn't activate." He met her eyes. "You walked into that corridor on your own. You touched the crown because you chose to." That was true. She couldn't argue it. She stood up. Her legs were steadier than they had any right to be. She looked at the crown for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Who else knows?" "My family. The assembly has been notified. That happened the moment you made contact. They'll want to meet with you." "The Meridian Assembly," she said it flatly. "The alien government." "Yes." "When?" 72 hours. They've been waiting for this longer than either of us has been alive. A brief hesitation. There's something else you should know, something I should have told you before you came here. She waited. I'm not the only cauldron who knew about you. His name was Rael, and he came in the night. She heard him before she saw him, not footsteps but a quality of changed air, a particular weight of presence that she was startled to discover she could now detect the way you detect weather before it arrives. She was in the library when he entered, and she had time to turn before he reached her. He was taller than Ethan by 3 inches and built differently, harder, with the kind of physical presence that doesn't come from exercise but from something intrinsic, something metabolic. His features were similar enough to Ethan's that she could read the family line, but where Ethan moved with restraint, this man moved with suppressed velocity, like something coiled. Dr. Voss, he said, I'm Rael Cauldron. Ethan's cousin. He looked at her with the same frank assessment the staff had been using, but without any of the deference, and the rightful alpha of this family line. Behind him in the doorway, she could see Ethan. His expression was careful and still. Rightful, she said, because the word had an edge she wanted to acknowledge. Rael's mouth curved. My father was the eldest son. Ethan's father was the second. The estate, the collection, the title, they passed to Ethan on a technicality that has been disputed for 16 years. As has, he added, with a look that encompassed the crown and the library in her, the right to conduct the treaty proceedings. I wasn't aware I was a trophy in a succession dispute. You're not a trophy. He moved further into the room, and she noticed the staff had appeared at the edges of the space, not threateningly, but positioned. You're the witness-bearer of the first treaty, which means your formal alignment is with the alpha of the bearing kind, not with whoever happened to own the estate when you arrived. He looked at Ethan. The treaty is clear on this. The treaty is clear, Ethan said quietly, that the witness-bearer chooses their alignment. Read Section 47 again. Section 47 was written for a different era. Section 47 is still active. They were looking at each other across the room, and Mara had the distinct impression she was watching a negotiation that had been running for 16 years, that had simply found a new flashpoint. She looked at them both. Then she picked up her notebook from the desk. Where is the treaty text? She said. Both men looked at her. The original, she clarified. In full, I want to read it. Silence. I'm the witness-bearer, correct? She held Rael's gaze and then Ethan's. That means the treaty is, at least in part, mine. I want to read the source document before I make any decisions about alignment or proceedings or anything else. Is that available, or do I need to go find it myself the way I found everything else in this house? Ethan's expression shifted, something that would eventually look in the months ahead like the particular expression he wore when she surprised him. It always looked the same, a brief recalibration, a dropping of some held tension. I'll get it, he said. She read it in 6 hours. It was in 3 languages, 2 of which she knew, and the third of which she was able to parse from context and from the carved narrative in the corridor below. The treaty was extraordinary, not because of its terms, though those were extraordinary, but because of its fundamental premise. The first treaty was not a negotiation between species. It was a recognition. It articulated, in the formal language of the Meridian Assembly, a principle that the Assembly had applied to every civilization they had encountered in their 11,000 years of documented history, that the measure of a species' right to sovereignty was not its power or its territory or its technology, but its demonstrated capacity for witness, for bearing, for taking responsibility not only for its own survival, but for the agreement that made survival collective. The human throne was not a political position. It was not a throne in any monarchical sense. It was a commitment to stand as the verified representative of humanity's capacity for covenant, to carry the weight of the agreement and be answerable to it. To be, in the treaty's exact language, the one who remains when others have left the room. The section on alignment was exactly as Ethan had described. The witness-bearer chose, not based on lineage or title or the outcome of an estate dispute, based on assessment, on the witness-bearer's determination of who, among the available bearing kind, was best capable of serving as co-representative. The alpha throne that the treaty required to stand alongside the human one. She closed the document at 2 in the morning and sat in the quiet of the library and thought about what she was being asked to carry. She had spent her career studying the evidence that humans had not been alone. Every artifact in the basement, every paper she had published, every conversation at 3 in the morning with colleagues who understood what the evidence suggested, all of it had been pointing here. She just hadn't known it. She had been tracing the outline of a door without knowing a door existed. She got up and went to find the corridor. She spent 3 hours in the chamber alone. Not touching the crown, she wasn't ready for that yet, for whatever the second contact would mean. She sat across from it on the stone floor and looked at it and felt the treaty in her, which was new and strange. A sense of obligation that had no prior category in her experience, a weight that didn't oppress so much as anchor. She thought about Ethan, she thought about Rael. She thought about what it meant to choose. She had read enough of the bearing kind's history, in the corridor carvings, in the documents the Institute had provided, in the 3 hours of frank conversation she and Ethan had shared in the days since the first contact, to understand the family rupture. Rael's father had been alpha by every traditional measure, eldest, strongest, the first to complete the physical transformation that marked adult bearing kind. Ethan's father had been quieter, more politically sophisticated, and when the old alpha died unexpectedly, had maneuvered the estate and title to himself on procedural grounds that were technically valid and widely resented. Ethan had inherited an argument he hadn't started. Rael had inherited a grievance he hadn't earned. Neither of them had done anything with it except maintain it. She thought about what Section 47 actually said, not its political interpretation, not the centuries of commentary, but the actual language. The witness-bearer shall align with the one who demonstrates the capacity to bear the covenant, who is able to hold the weight of the agreement without being changed by the holding. She sat with that, she let it settle. Then she stood up, and she went back upstairs, and she found Ethan and Rael in the dining room in the particular silence of 2 people who have been arguing and recently stopped. "I've made my decision," she said. They both looked at her. "But not the way either of you is expecting. Sit down." She had been in the house for 22 days when the Meridian Assembly arrived. They came as they had always come, in ships that humans had been documenting as anomalous atmospheric phenomena for the better part of a century, landing in the long field behind Cauldron House at dawn, with a precision that suggested they had done this at this exact location before. 3 of them came to the house, escorted by the groundskeepers, moving with the slow deliberateness of people who understood that their presence was significant and chose not to perform that significance. The lead assembly representative was called, in the closest phonetic approximation, Serev. 7 feet tall, bipedal, with the bioluminescent skin patterning that Mara had only seen in classified photographs, Serev stood in the great hall and looked at her with what she would eventually understand was the assembly expression of formal recognition. A long, sustained attention that carried no judgment, only witness. "Vas Hubers," Serev said in accented but precise English. "The treaty woke, we felt it." "Yes," she said, 43 days ago. I'm sorry it took me this long." The alien tilted their head. "You are not late. The treaty has no schedule. It waits for the right." A pause. "We will speak of terms." "We'll speak of terms," she agreed. "But first, I want you to hear something." She presented what she'd worked out over the previous week, sitting alone in the library with the treaty text and her field notes, and eventually with Ethan and Rael separately, and then together. a proposed amendment to the succession provision that would replace the alpha designation with a joint representation structure, drawing on the treaty's own language about the bearing kind's original purpose. Not one alpha throne, but a council of two, one from each branch of the family line, their decisions requiring consensus. The position of witness-bearer would not align with either exclusively, but would serve as the tie-breaking vote on matters of treaty interpretation. It was not what any of them had expected. Rael had looked at her for a long time when she'd presented it, and then said, "This doesn't resolve the succession." "No," she'd agreed. "It dissolves it. The succession dispute exists because the alpha position is singular. If it isn't singular, there's nothing to dispute." He'd been quiet. "You're restructuring an 11,000-year-old institution." "I'm extending it. The treaty's purpose isn't to preserve a particular power structure. Its purpose is to maintain an agreement across time. The structure should serve the purpose, not the other way around." She'd looked at him steadily. "You know that. You know the history as well as I do." Something had moved behind his eyes. Not capitulation, she wasn't asking for that. Something more careful, a reassessment. "I would need to see the legal argument in full," he'd said. "I know, I'm writing it." Ethan had said nothing for a long time. Then, why? "Because the two of you have been burning energy on a dispute that serves neither of you for 16 years, and the treaty needs both of you functional. And because," she added, "the treaty is about capacity for covenant. That's what I'm supposed to be verifying. A family that can't hold its own internal agreement is not in a position to hold one with an alien civilization." He'd looked at her, that recalibrating look, and then nodded once slowly. Sarev listened to the full proposal in the great hall, while the two other assembly representatives stood at their back, and the whole Cauldron household stood at the edges of the room. She presented it in 40 minutes, drawing from the treaty text, from precedent in the Assembly's own legal history that she had compiled from the documents in the basement, from basic structural logic. When she finished, Sarev was quiet for a very long time. "The human witness-bearer," Sarev said at last, "proposes an amendment to the fundamental governance structure of the first treaty's co-parties." "Yes." "On her first day of formal proceedings." 22nd day, technically." Another long silence. Then, "The Assembly will require a period of review." "Of course." "And the bearing kind," Sarev looked at Ethan, then Rael, "the co-parties consent to review." Ethan spoke first, "We consent." A pause, then Rael, "We consent." The great hall was very quiet. The light was early morning gold through the tall windows. Mara stood at the center of it all and felt the weight of what she was carrying, and it didn't feel like too much. It felt like exactly the right amount, the specific density of a thing that was real. The review took 4 months. She spent them at Cauldron House, working from the library, making the arguments in formal assembly correspondence, and in the careful ongoing conversation with Ethan and Rael that had gradually, over those months, stopped being a negotiation and started being something else. A table where 3 people sat who were trying to understand something larger than any of them. She learned, during those months, what the bearing kind felt like to live alongside. The warmth of them, not metaphorical, the actual warmth, their higher resting temperature that made the house what it was, that she had felt through her boots on the first night. The heightened perception, turned outward as a kind of constant low-level attention to the people in their proximity, the tracking, which she had first found unnerving and gradually understood as care, as the physical expression of a protective instinct that had no off switch. The deliberateness of their movement, which was not slowness but precision, a body that could move very fast, choosing not to. She learned that Ethan hummed tunelessly when he was thinking, low under his breath, barely audible unless you were in the same room and paying attention. She learned that Rael had a habit of going still in the middle of conversations, not zoning out but the opposite, concentrating so completely that everything except the point of focus simply ceased to operate for a moment. She learned that the rivalry between them was not hatred, had never been hatred, was instead a kind of permanent friction generated by two people who were too similar to easily occupy the same space and too connected to leave it. She watched them, over those 4 months, begin to disagree without the weight of the succession behind every word. Not easily, not without backsliding, without old patterns reasserting and requiring patient navigation, but genuinely. She watched them figure out how to be in the same room as equals. She did not tell either of them that this had been the real test. The 3 months before the assembly ratification were not clean. Nothing was clean. Mara had worked in field archaeology long enough to know that the distance between a discovery and its acknowledgement was rarely a straight line, and what she was navigating now was the same fundamental problem at a scale that made her field notes feel inadequate. The treaty was real. The bearing kind were real. The assembly was real, and they had been conducting a slow, patient, multi-century dialogue with a species that didn't know it was in a dialogue. And now the witness-bearer had been activated, and the formal proceedings had begun, and somewhere in the tangle of all of that, she still had to get out of bed every morning and make decisions. The hardest was the one she hadn't announced, what to tell. She had contacts, real ones, not the polished institutional kind, a loose network of colleagues and researchers who had spent careers reading the same evidence she had, reaching the same conclusions she had, publishing papers in journals that mainstream academia treated with the particular condescension reserved for ideas that were about to be proved right. She had people who deserved to know. She brought it to Ethan first, because that was who she had established the habit of bringing things to. He was in the library. He was always in the library. She'd come to understand in the evenings because he thought better in rooms with books, which was something they had in common. He was standing at the window when she came in, which he did when he was already thinking about something difficult. "The disclosure question," she said. He turned, "Yes. I need to contact people outside this house. The treaty doesn't prohibit it." He came away from the window and sat in the chair across from the fireplace, the one she'd claimed as hers in the first weeks because it faced the door. He never sat in it when she wasn't there. She had noticed this. The disclosure prohibitions in the original text were between the bearing kind and the general human population. The witness-bearer has a different category. What category? Discretionary. The treaty language is, it says you may share with those who demonstrate the capacity to bear witness alongside you. He looked at her steadily. It was always assumed the witness-bearer would build a network. The covenant works better with more people holding it. She thought about her colleagues. She thought about Dr. Lena Farok in Cairo, who had spent 20 years mapping pre-contact sites and who had never once softened her conclusions to make them more palatable. She thought about Marcus Wen at the Institute for Anomalous Studies in Vancouver, who had lost 2 grants for publishing analysis that was inconvenient. She thought about Yuki Mori, who had written the definitive paper on the first contact timeline discrepancy, and who had been quietly removed from her university position 2 years ago for refusing to retract it. People who had been carrying parts of this for years, without knowing what they were carrying. "Tell me more about the capacity to bear witness," she said. So he did. He talked for 2 hours, pulling books from the shelves when references required illustration, and she sat across from him and listened and occasionally interrupted with the kind of precise, incisive questions that made him pause and reconsider and come back with a better answer, which she had noticed made him more animated rather than less. He was at his best in conversation that required him to think, rather than conversation that required him to perform. Around midnight, she looked up from her notes and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing." A pause. "I was thinking about what I expected when we identified you." And he was quiet for a moment. I expected someone more like us, more like the bearing kind. The treaty has always been interpreted as requiring a human analog, someone with the same kind of weight to them, the same gravity of purpose. He looked at the fire. You're like that, but you approach everything like a problem to be solved. You don't carry weight the way we carry it. You set it down, examine it, decide whether it belongs to you, and then pick it back up. You choose to carry it every time. She considered this. Is that a criticism? No, very certain. It's the most human thing I've ever seen, and I've spent my life around humans. He glanced back at her. I think the treaty knew what it was doing. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notes, not what he had said, but something she would return to later, and turned back to the question of disclosure. She contacted Lena Farrokh first, because Lena was the most rigorous and the most likely to immediately demand evidence, which Mara wanted. She sent a carefully worded message through a channel she trusted, asking for a secure call. Lena called back in 4 hours. Mara, her voice on the connection was careful. The last time you contacted me through this channel, you'd found a pre-contact inscription in a private collection that you couldn't publish. I remember. What did you find this time? The source, Mara said. All of it, the treaty, the bearing kind, the assembly. A pause. I need you to come to England. Silence on the line. Then, how certain are you? I have touched the witness crown of the first treaty and been verified by it. I have read the treaty in full. I have met the Meridian Assembly in person. I have been conducting formal treaty proceedings for the past 6 weeks. She paused. On a certainty scale of 1 to 10, Lena, I'm at 11. Another silence, longer. I'm in Cairo, Lena said. I can be there in 48 hours. Bring your notes on the Yellen Basin sites. A pause. You know what those sites are? Yes, Mara said. So do you, I think, but now I can tell you why. Lena Farrokh arrived on a Wednesday with 3 notebooks and a look of contained volcanic anticipation. She stood in the entry hall of Cauldron House and felt the warmth of the floor through her shoes and looked at Mara with the eyes of someone who has been waiting a very long time for permission to believe what she already knew. Mara took her to the basement. She showed her everything. She watched Lena move through the collection with the methodical grace of 20 years of practice, picking up objects and setting them down with careful hands, pausing at pieces that corroborated her own research, asking questions in a low, steady voice that never wavered. She watched Lena stop in front of the shelf that concealed the corridor door and turn to look at her. There's more, Lena said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She took her down. In the corridor, Lena went quiet. She moved along the carved narrative on the walls with her fingers barely hovering above the surface, reading, and Mara watched her face. She watched the moment Lena understood what she was reading. The moment the sequence resolved from interesting to incontrovertible, and she watched Lena stop and put her hand flat against the wall and close her eyes for a few seconds. When she opened them, they were bright. 3,000 years before the official first contact, Lena said. This predates every government document by 3 millennia. Yes. The Yellen Basin sites are staging areas, pre-treaty contact points. Yes. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said very quietly, why didn't they tell us? They told the ones who were ready to hear it, Mara said. The treaty's structure required the human side to come to the evidence, to follow the thread without being handed the answer. The Assembly's framework for first contact with any civilization always involves a period of independent discovery. The civilization has to demonstrate that it can find the truth on its own before it's given access to the broader conversation. And we found it. We were always finding it, paper by paper, site by site, retracted study by retracted study. Mara looked at the carvings. The treaty activation wasn't triggered by me touching the crown. It was triggered by the accumulated weight of human research reaching a threshold. The crown was just the instrument, the formal acknowledgement. She paused. We'd been earning it for 100 years. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then Marcus and Yuki need to know. I know. This is going to change everything. Yes. Lena turned to look at her. Are you afraid? Mara thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. I'm afraid of doing it wrong, she said. I'm not afraid of it. Lena nodded. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. Marcus came 2 weeks later. Yuki arrived 4 days after that. The library of Cauldron House, which had been built for solitude, adapted to the new weight of 4 researchers who had spent their careers on the same problem from 4 different angles and were now, for the first time, in the same room. Ethan watched this from the edges, which she noticed, and one evening after the others had gone to their rooms, she found him in the kitchen. He made tea when he was processing things, which was the bearing kind equivalent of pacing, and she said, "What are you thinking?" He set down the kettle. "I'm thinking about what the treaty means," he said, "when it says capacity for witness, when it says all parties who have demonstrated it." He looked at her. "It wasn't referring only to you." "No. Marcus and Yuki and Lena, they have the capacity." "Yes. The expanded provision is going to be larger than 3 people," she said. "I know," she leaned against the counter. "That's the point. The treaty isn't a document between representatives, it's an infrastructure. It's designed to grow." He poured the tea, handed her a cup. They stood in the warm kitchen, and she thought about the scope of what she was building, which was not what she had arrived in England to do, which was not what anyone had planned, and which felt more right than anything she had ever put her hands to. "The succession," he said, "the proposal you made to Rail, the joint representation structure." "Yes. It works for the family," he said. "But if the witness-bearer provision is going to expand, if more humans are going to hold the covenant," he stopped. "The governance structure needs to scale," she finished. "Yes, I'm working on that." He looked at her over his tea. That expression again, the one that had started as recalibration and had, over 5 months of shared work and shared meals, and the specific intimacy of a problem worked together late into the night, become something she didn't have a category for but had stopped trying to avoid. "You've been working on it for weeks," he said. "I've been working on it since the first night in the corridor." She set her cup down. "You opened a door for me and I walked through it. I'm not going to walk through and find the room is exactly what you told me it was and nothing more. That's not who I am." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." The kitchen was warm. The house breathed around them. She was aware, as she had become increasingly aware over the preceding weeks, of the specific quality of his attention, which was different from Rail's. Less friction, more depth. The particular focus of a person who had spent a long time learning to be careful with things that mattered to him. "The treaty is going to change things," she said. "On both sides. For your family, for your people, not just the succession. The concealment provision is going to be renegotiated in the formal proceedings. The bearing kind have been hidden for 4 centuries. That's ending." "I know. Are you afraid of it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm afraid of doing it wrong," he said. "I'm not afraid of it." She recognized her own words, and the echo of them settled between them in the warm kitchen like something decided. "Good," she said. Rail found her in the field the night before the assembly ratification, which was where she had taken to going when she needed to think without walls. He came quietly. They all came quietly, and stood beside her looking at the tree line. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "When I arrived here, I was using you, not maliciously or not only maliciously, but the treaty proceedings were an opportunity, and I treated them that way before I understood what they actually were." A pause. "What you were." "And now I understand." He was quiet for a moment. "The joint representation, the proposal you made. I fought it because I thought it was a political maneuver. A way for Ethan to keep what he'd inherited without having to prove he deserved it. And now I've spent 3 months watching you build something that has no precedent, from a document that's older than recorded history, with 3 colleagues who showed up because you called them and they trusted you, and he stopped. I understand what the word covenant means in a way I didn't before." Another pause. "The treaty didn't need a battle between Ethan and me. It needed someone to look at the battle and make something better from the parts." She looked at the field. "I couldn't have done it without the battle. The succession dispute was the pressure that made the amendment possible. You needed each other to need something different." He was quiet. "You're still irritating," he said finally. "You've mentioned. I mean it as a compliment now." "I know." He turned to look at her in the near dark, and she met his gaze, and what passed between them was not warmth exactly. That was Ethan's register, but something colder and more certain. A recognition between 2 people who both moved through the world by assessing it without illusion, who had assessed each other and arrived at a conclusion they could live with. "The expanded provision," he said. "The witness-bearer network you're building." "Yes. I'd like to be part of it in a formal capacity, not as Alpha Throne, as something else, an advocate. A voice for the bearing kind's interests in the ongoing human network." He held her gaze. "If you'll have me." She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. "Yes," she said. He nodded, once. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a flask, which she had learned over the preceding months was how the bearing kind marked agreements. Not with words or signatures, but with shared warmth. Something liquid passed between parties. The most ancient and simple of human gestures translated into the idiom of people who had been watching humans long enough to understand which gestures were the real ones. He offered it to her. She took it, drank, handed it back. The field was dark and cold and enormous around them, and somewhere beyond the tree line, 11,000 years of history was waiting to be formally acknowledged, and she stood in it and felt the whole weight of it and was, for the first time in 5 months, completely at rest. The week after Lena arrived, Mara spent 4 days writing. Not field notes, not correspondence, not the formal legal arguments for the treaty amendment. Those were already drafted. This was something else. A document she had no name for yet, in the language that didn't yet exist, for an audience that didn't yet know it existed. She sat in the library with the door closed and wrote for 6 hours a day, and came out for meals and went back. And the others left her to it, because they were researchers, and they understood when someone was in the middle of a thing. On the 4th day, Ethan brought her dinner at the desk without being asked, and stood for a moment reading the open pages. "What is this?" he said. "A record," she said. "The treaty is a document, but documents don't carry context. In 11,000 years, when someone comes after us and finds the amendment, I want them to understand not just what was decided, but why. Not just the terms, but the people who made them and what they were afraid of and what they hoped." She turned a page. "The bearing kind have been keeping records since before your family's memory. The Assembly has archives that span 12 civilizations. I want the human contribution to the record to be real, actual, the kind of history that tells you what it felt like, not just what happened." He set the dinner tray beside her. He read another line. "You're writing yourself into the treaty record," he said. "I'm writing all of us into it. Lena and Marcus and Yuki and you and Rael and the housekeeper who made sure I had coffee every morning before I'd asked for it, and the groundskeeper who moved the shelf in the basement without questions when I needed access to the corridor." She looked up at him. "The covenant is made by people. I want the record to show which people." He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down across from her, not in the formal way, but settling into the chair the way you settle into a space that's become yours, and said, Tell me what you want to include about the early months. I may remember things differently than you." She looked at him. "The record should have more than one voice," he said simply. She pushed the notebook toward him. He picked up a pen. They wrote together for the rest of the evening, and the record they made was not a tidy thing, not a formal accounting, but the real shape of what it had been. Two people disagreeing about facts and then reconciling them, interrupting each other, laughing at moments that would be incomprehensible without context, adding context, arguing about which context mattered, arriving by degrees at something truer than either of them would have reached alone. At some point after midnight, she looked up and found him watching her the way he had in the kitchen, with the specific, careful attention of a person who has decided something. She set down her pen. "I know what you're not saying," she told him. He didn't deflect. "Then you know I mean it." The library was quiet around them, warm and old and full of the weight of everything that had happened in the past 5 months. She thought about who she had been when she arrived, the woman standing in the rain outside the gate with soaking transfer papers and student loans and 3 published papers, and a lifetime of evidence pointing at something she hadn't let herself fully believe yet. She thought about the corridor and the crown and the stone floor and the 3 hours she'd lost and everything that had come after. She thought about who she was now, which was not entirely different and not at all the same. "The record should note," she said, "that the witness bearer's personal and professional circumstances became significantly entangled over the course of the treaty proceedings." "Is that the formal language you want?" "No," she said, "but I'm still figuring out the right words for some of it." He reached across the desk and turned the notebook toward himself and wrote something in his even, precise hand, then turned it back to her. She read it. She read it again. "That works," she said. He picked up his pen, she picked up hers. They went back to the record. The house breathed around them. The treaty hummed in the stone. Somewhere in the corridor below, the crown sat on its plinth and did what it had been doing for 11,000 years. It waited, patient and certain, for the people who were ready to bear it. They were. The assembly's formal response arrived in the library on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by a secondary assembly representative who appeared in the way they always appeared, without preceding notice, without ceremony, and placed a document on her desk that was written in all 3 treaty languages simultaneously. She read it, then she read it again. Then she got up and found them both. "The amendment passed," she said, "with one modification." They looked at her. "The joint representation model is accepted. The tie-breaking provision stands." "The modification is," she paused. "The modification is to the definition of witness bearer. The assembly has expanded it. It's no longer a single holder position." "What does that mean?" Rail said. "It means I don't hold it alone." She looked at them both. "The expanded definition includes, and I'm quoting, all parties who have demonstrated capacity to bear the covenant and have been verified by the instrument, plural." She held up the document. "All 3 of us signed onto the same terms in the Assembly's accounting. All 3 of us have been carrying this since the first night." The library was quiet. The light came through the windows the way it always did at this hour, long and amber, making the spines of the books glow. Ethan was looking at her with that expression, the recalibration, the dropped tension, and this time it didn't resolve back into careful reserve. It just stayed open. Rail's jaw was doing something complicated. Finally he said, "You planned this." "No," she said honestly. "I proposed an amendment and made a legal argument. The assembly made a decision." She set the document on the table. "But I had a theory." "Which was?" "That the treaty's purpose was never about finding one person who could carry it. That was always the wrong reading. The human throne, the alpha throne, the covenant doesn't work if only one person or one species is holding the weight. It only works if everyone is." She looked at him. "The original treaty was made between parties, not by a single sovereign." It survived 11,000 years not because one person bore it well, but because the agreement itself was real, made between people who actually showed up. Rail was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and picked up the document. He read it carefully, the way he read everything with that total concentration. When he finished, he set it back down. "Your theory was correct," he said, not graciously, practically, like an acknowledgement of evidence. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the frank, assessing look she'd learned to read as his version of honesty. "You're more irritating than I expected, Vas Hubers." "I know. The name suits you." She thought about the corridor and the crown and the 3 hours she'd spent on stone floors and the 4 months of correspondence and the particular weight of being the person who remained in the room. She thought about her student loans, which she still had, and her 3 published papers, which were going to need a 4th, and her mother, the librarian who had raised her to be exacting about sources. "Yes," she said again, "I know." The formal proceedings took another month. The treaty was amended, certified, and reactivated, a process that involved another contact with the Crown, which she navigated the second time without losing 3 hours, which the bearing kind found reassuring, and which she found only moderately encouraging. The Assembly's ratification ceremony was held in the Great Hall of Cauldron House, attended by 7 Assembly representatives, and the full Cauldron household, and via a secure transmission that tested several governmental classification systems, 3 members of a human institution that had been waiting, silently and without official mandate, for this moment for 50 years. After it was over, she stood in the long field behind the house in the February cold and watched the Assembly ships leave. They went slowly at first, holding position for a while at the edge of the tree line, and she had the impression they were pausing the way you pause at the end of something important, taking it in before it becomes history. Then they went fast, and the field was just a field again. She heard footsteps behind her, 2 sets, and didn't turn around. "So," Ethan said. He came to stand beside her, facing the empty sky. "What happens now?" "For the treaty, there's a scheduled review in 3 years. I'll need to be here for that." "Here or reachable?" "Here." "Good," he said it without elaboration. Rail appeared on her other side. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her and one to Ethan without comment, which she had noticed was how he offered things without ceremony, because the offering was the ceremony. "The basement collection," he said. "The cataloging project, is that still ongoing?" "I have 14 months left on my contract." "Contract?" He said the word with a slight inflection she'd learned to recognize as humor trying not to show itself. "You're the witness-bearer of the first treaty. You are the co-holder of a covenant between species. You are, in the Assembly's formal classification, a throne, and you're here on a contract. The contract pays 40% above the standard Xenoarch salary," she said. "I have student loans." Rail looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the sky. "We can discuss the financial terms," Ethan said carefully, "for an extended engagement." "I'm not staying because of the salary," she said. "I'm staying because the work isn't done. The treaty is active, but the catalog is incomplete, and there are 3 objects in the basement I haven't been able to identify, and the expanded witness-bearer provision raises questions about what the original succession structure was actually designed to prevent that I want to research." She paused. "And because the heating system in this house is remarkable, and I am extremely tired of being cold." The field was quiet, the tree line was dark. The lights of Cauldron House were visible over their shoulders, warm and breathing, which it was and always had been, and which she would never stop finding slightly remarkable. She drank her coffee. "Also," she said, "you hum out of tune and it is genuinely terrible, and I feel I deserve some acknowledgement for having put up with it for 5 months." Ethan turned to look at her. Then he laughed, not the polite social laugh she'd heard twice in the early weeks, but an actual laugh, short and surprised. "Noted," he said. Rael said nothing, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at the field with an expression she had no existing category for, something that sat between respect and exasperation, and something further beyond that, something that had no single word in any of the 3 treaty languages she could read. She decided not to name it. Some things held better when you left them as what they were, rather than forcing them into the shape of a word. She finished her coffee. The morning came up cold and clear over the tree line. The treaty, 11,000 years old and reactivated and amended and alive, hummed in the bones of the earth under the field, or maybe in her own bones, or maybe, as she was beginning to understand, those were the same thing. She stood there between the two of them and bore the weight of it. It turned out to be exactly as heavy as it needed to be.